I think the first thing that struck me one of the first things that struck me when I moved to Edmonton myself was the invisibility of the Aboriginal community here. I remember talking to my partner saying, how come we don't see Aboriginal folk in shops, working in shops, in positions of leadership, in our media? The portrayals that we saw were largely negative, if they existed at all, and that's kind of very striking. So that was a very sort of personal experience. The other personal experience that strikes me is when you come into Edmonton by air and you come into Vancouver by air. When you arrive in Vancouver airport, you're in no doubt that you're coming into a place that has a long history of Indigenous population. The first thing you see are those amazing carvings and statues and other things which say very powerfully that this is Indigenous land you're coming into. When you come into our airport, Edmonton, I just came in a few weeks ago to the new part as well, there's nothing that I could see that suggests to you in any vivid way that you're coming into a place that has had Indigenous population for 10,000 years. So I think in some very kind of ways like that, we make our Aboriginal history invisible. Our names and our streets, our parks, I can't think of hardly any that have got Aboriginal. Oh, there it goes. That was good timing. We've got some councillors here. We don't have any parks or anything named after Indigenous peoples. And in fact, what's interesting, we do have parks named after people who exploited our Indigenous people. For example, we have a whole area, Oliver, and parks named after Frank Oliver, who's a very controversial person in the history of our city, and who, we speak to many Aboriginal people, will talk about how he exploited Aboriginal people, and there has a sorry part in their history, and yet we honour him, but we don't honour our Indigenous people. And then to somewhere like Boyle Street, where I work, and seeing that invisibility continuing, where our folk don't see themselves anywhere and are often not welcome in a lot of parts of our city as well. That's another kind of part of it. The invisibility is what happens to Aboriginal people in our city. It's almost like if we go just take a minute, because I think it's important, there's almost what I call a virtual apartheid in our city that we have. And it's more insidious than apartheid in South Africa, because at least that was legislated, something you could fight against. So the stories I hear, and one was picked up here, a guy trying to get housing, not being able to get it. We just a few months ago, one of our staff took an Aboriginal couple to be housed, and the landlord took one look at the couple. It was all arranged, everything was set up on the phone, took one look and said, "Oh, I don't house people like you." And that was in 2012. And the landlord felt that was all right to say something like that. We see people going for job interviews, trying to get jobs and being turned away, being the public space where in our parks and in quasi-public spaces like malls, folk being moved out of it, moved on, largely Aboriginal folk. So even in the public space, that has contracted. There's very few places, I would certainly say, homeless or street-involved Aboriginal people, which is the largest percentage of the street-involved and homeless population are Aboriginal. So very few places they can go without being moved on. They're safe places to be. So that makes them invisible too, because other members of the public, non-Aboriginal members of the public, have very few opportunities to interact because those folk are not even present in the spaces they might be going into. So those are some of the things that have struck me here, personally and professionally.